Okay, let me see. I just want to bounce right in here, but I want to sort of start with a little definition, because if you've read the beginning of the book, you'll see what a printer's devil is, but I'm not sure many of you know that. Because I was a printer's devil. I worked on a newspaper in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories as a printer's helper. I wasn't a printer's apprentice, but I was a printer's helper. And printer's devils also were known for the mischief they could create for the master printer, changing the inks and things like that, and turning the plates upside down. So I didn't do that, but I would have, but I didn't know how. No training. But anyway, that sort of introduced me to this notion of the printer's devils, and then I started researching it and finding out that a tremendous number of people started out, politicians, top newspaper editors, filmmakers, you name it. They were printer's devils to start. That's where they got their start. So if you read the book, you'll see that there's a little definition of them at the beginning of the book. I want to ask a question here before I whet your appetite fully with a little reading. How many people are journalists or former journalists or wannabe journalists? Or how many? Show of hands. There's 2, 3, 4. Okay, yes, and there you are too. No, this is a fun book for you because this takes you back 120 years to what journalism or pioneer journalism was actually like, and the kind of things that went on in the newsrooms of old. And I think it was fun for me to research it because I worked for newspapers for a while myself. But this is kind of a little different story. So let me just start by reading you a little excerpt from one of the papers, one of the editions of the paper. This goes back to about 1895, right, when the trail was first starting up. There was a mining town and a scrappy little rough town for a while, and then a guy named Fritz Heinz brought in the smelter, which blew in 1896. And that same year, Thompson published his paper in the same date. I think it was January 28th, and he ran this little piece about a fellow pioneer journalist, or tramp printer as they're sometimes known. And this is about another journalist. Greg mentioned Robert Lowry, Colonel Lowry. He was one of the real iconoclasts of the Kootenay area. And this fellow was as well. This is a fellow named John Houston. John Houston was just about everything, including an alcoholic. But then most of them were alcoholics at some point. But John ran something called the Nelson Tribune in the 1890s, and he ran other papers too. And he was a bit of a gadfly, but he was mayor of Nelson at some point in the early century. He was an MLA. He was just generally a well-known guy, and he made the rounds thoroughly. But here's what happened in 1896 on that January day. He was visited by a Canadian Pacific Railway superintendent, a guy named Robert Marpole, and he was the Western Division head of the railway. And as Greg pointed out yesterday, the railway was crucially important to developing all the areas that he mentioned as well. And certainly it was in the Kootenays, that and the ferry systems that were developed, the old stern wheelers. That was all CPR work. Anyway, this fellow Marpole visits the Nelson Tribune office. He wants to force a retraction because he feels that he's been done wrong. And he asks who wrote that article. He wants to know the name of the writer of the article that apparently he wasn't happy with. And John Houston, the editor, refused to give the name. So Marpole then announced that the article was a lie, and the man who wrote it was a liar. Houston then said that he wrote it, and Marpole called Houston a liar. Houston told Marpole that unless he could talk decently, he must get out of the Tribune office. Marpole refused to go and called Houston a liar for the third time. And Houston hit Marpole over the head with a ruler. A typical newsroom activity, right, Mark? And Marpole threw a dictionary at Houston. And then they closed with each other. Marpole possessed himself with the scissors and tried to stab Houston. but others present, and more present than mine, took the scissors away from Marpole. In the melee, Houston was biffed, typical language of the newspaper newsroom those days, and biffed in the eye, and Marpole had the end of his finger bitten nearly off. Marpole had Houston arrested, and the editor paid a fine of $10. Marpole announced at the close of the trial that he was not satisfied, whereupon Houston informed him that he could get satisfaction wherever and whenever he pleased. So, typical news item from 1896 in the Trail Creek News. I've got a few more for you, too, that you'll get a kick out of. And I've put the wrong things up here. The repartee that went on there in print was quite common among editors in the Kootenays, and there were a bundle of them. Ron Shearer writes a lot about them. Greg has written about them, and I have myself. So they're a real rivalry type group, and they get after each other in print quite regularly. It's just a real find when you do a book like this to find all these little nuggets where they just let themselves fly against some other rival newspaper. In this case, Houston comes into play again when he calls the editor of the founding editor of the Trail Creek News, a guy named William Fentress, a Johnny-come-lately. And Thompson, he shot back. "'Tis true we came to British Columbia later than the dyspeptic old windbag who inflates the Tribune." But no holes barred here, right? But unlike him, we have not outworn our welcome, and we are apt to stay in this country after he is gone and forgotten. I should mention that Thompson's an American, but I'll talk to him about his life a little bit more in the talk. But the editors I talk about in Printers' Devils, or the Printers' Devils I talk about, are mostly Americans coming across the border back in the 1890s and later. So here's another one that's a little closer to home. Rosalind Miner. The Rosalind Miner was a big paper in those days. It became a daily paper, and went on for quite a few decades actually. But and it comes into play in my book quite a bit. But here's another little comment. If the distinguished journalist, this is Thompson again, who imagines he is filling a long-felt want in Rosalind, would come off from his rhetorical stilts, from which he is engaged in talking over the heads of the select few who comprise the subscription list of the Rosalind Miner, the Miner would enjoy a better standing in the limited area in which it circulates. Now, as I said, these are tramp journalists. These are guys who put a Washington hand press on their backs and somehow got up into the Kootenays and other parts of BC, set up their printing press whenever there was a gold strike and a little community developed, or a CPR station. And they started to print their newspapers, quite a few of which are covered in the book, right? I don't have a platform here, but anyway, you can take a look later. I found them quite fascinating, and the story of these little weekly newspapers, and particularly the one I'm talking about, really give you some sense of what the 30 years I look at, the 30 years of publishing I look at, did for the community or did to the community. So a lot of that is in the book, and some of it's pretty nasty stuff. Some of it's pretty enlightening. They were very much business people. Their job was to make money and to support the local business community through their advertising. They supported the paper through their advertising, and the subscription list would, of course, give some money, but most of it was these editors getting money from the business community. And in Trail, in particular, with the big smelter starting and the Copper King from Butte, Montana, coming in and really bringing the big money to town, that opened up quite a lot of potential for the Trail Creek News, because then he had some money to play with. They bought an ad every week, and it just generally sort of filled his pockets a little bit, and he started to be able to develop the press. I was going to tell you, William Thompson, William Fentress Thompson is his name. He actually shows up in Trail Creek Landing, which is the name of the town originally. A bunch of scruffy trees and a few buildings and a makeshift hotel called the Trail House. And he sort of, first edition comes out on October 19th, 1895. And he had to print it on some kind of store shop paper. Like, it's not newsprint, because the newsprint supplier in Spokane has failed to get his delivery to the Trail Creek Landing spot. And so, by ferry, by the way, by stern wheeler. So he is unable to print it on real newsprint. apologizes the next edition and says, it could have been a lot prettier, but at least it's in your hands. So that was the kind of guy he was. In the early days, and for most of the time he was editor up until 1898, he signed himself W.F. Thompson. And I think people puzzled about that. Why wouldn't he use his whole name? So one of his staff members, a bit of a wag, I'm not sure he kept his job, said that the W.F. actually stood for wrong font, Thompson. And I thought to myself, maybe a printer's devil got in there somehow and fixed things up. But no, Fentress actually, he came up to Trail, he was flat broke. His newspaper in Sprague, Washington had burned down with half the town. And he and Martha, his partner, and his adopted son, Los Bernard, show up, and he's a very capable printer's devil himself, by the way. Los is 15 years old, but he knows his way around a printing press. So they came up, and they just basically decided, we're going to start a newspaper here. They knew Fritz Heinz was coming with his factory, coming along well. It was going to be blown in a little while. So they were right on his heels. Now, it's kind of interesting. He basically had to hack a home, a cottage or a cabin, come office out of the tree trunks in Trail, right, just below the smelter. And he sort of managed to do that. And that was sort of the beginnings of the paper. It's interesting, too, because it goes to show how dedicated he was to Fritz Heinz, because Trail at the time was starting to get really polluted, almost as bad as the wildfires here today. But, I mean, the mountainside was starting to deteriorate, and Trail was a mess. But for Thompson, supporting his friend Heinz, it was bomb to the nostrils. So people were joking on it, but Trailites were told that it was bomb to the nostrils, famous line. So yeah, I wanted to read a little bit about this early time. So the Thompsons were well primed to deliver all the news that W.F. wrong font saw fit to print, including some rumors of a gold strike in Washington, a prospector's suicide, a report on a fireman's masquerade ball, and a half-page advertisement from the British Columbia Mining and Smelting Company, which was owned by Frederick Augustus Heinz. In the first edition, as I say, they printed it on wrapping paper. But here's a little example of another minor setback. While he was building the home and office, and you can imagine lumber's not that easy to come by, right? In a kind of pioneering town. So he writes that he's a little disturbed, he's a little bit unhappy with the locals, because he says the editor of the news is hostile and is looking for 2 timber thieves. Thompson announced and promised a lifetime subscription to the Trail Creek News to anyone who could identify the thieves. So can you imagine? Well, I'm not quite done there yet, sorry. Yeah, I mentioned that they were doing a lot of battle with each other. This rivalry was constant at every editorial page every week. And they published other people batting the heads over somebody else too. So it was quite lively. That was the good news. And they also battled with the readers. Readers got dumped on, right? You can't criticize the newspaper. So there were a number of poems about how the readers were criticizing, and he was backing them up and saying, "No, you can't criticize me." Anyway, I found it interesting that the largesse ended and the happiness ended when it came to the ethnic minorities, some of whom Elwyn talked about and Greg talked about yesterday. The Chinese and Japanese got a really rough treatment in the earlier years, from 1896 on through to 1923, and then afterwards as well. And there were, of course, during the war, there were the internment camps of the Japanese up in the Kootenays around New Denver. But that was past the time I covered. But it was a horrifying story too. And as you know, there's a museum up there, so it's quite interesting to go to the old village. I think South Asians also got hit pretty hard. They were working in the forestry industry around the area, so that would have been another point of attack for Wrong Font and for other subsequent editors. They were racist, point blank, and that's the way they treated things. I think one of the most interesting things was the way they treated the Duke of Wars. I don't know if you all know about that. I'm sure you do. The Duke of Wars came to the Kootenays in 1908. Some came earlier, but the flock of them came with Peter the Lordly Verrigan in 1908 and settled in the Kootenays and became very productive people in the area, but they were very much to themselves, as you know, and not very much to the liking of the Trail Creek News or the Trail News, which came on in 1900. They were, I mean, I'll read you a passage here in a minute, but it was interesting. They were the second printer's devil and the second editor of the paper and owner of the paper is a guy named William Essling. Billy Essling, or Little Billy as he's sometimes called, he was 5'3", is often referred to as Rosalind's gentleman journalist, but he was anything but a gentleman when it came to Doukhobors. In fact, he referred to them as the Dukes and Duchesses, and he later actually pursued them again as a member of Parliament and tried to get them deported, as the paper continually did as well, and the Legion and the Board of Trade and any number of other established organizations in the Kootenays. They didn't do well. Anyway, one of the editors that came along a little bit later, a guy named Babs Babington, kind of contradicted Essling. He said they are communists as regards property and are all vegetarians, as their religion forbids them to kill any living thing. And we added that returns from their produce are not just individual gain. It all goes to a common fund and all share in its benefits. He later concluded that those who are interested in humanity and how man is working his way to a higher destiny can find food for reflection in this simple, plain, and God-fearing community. Pretty nice words. They didn't appear very often in the Trail News, but there they were. There were some editors decided they should describe the community a little bit differently than what Billy Essling and Wrongfont were doing. It's interesting because when you read this, you think, geez, what's going on? Has the editor started to become a socialist? You know, this is pretty socialistic stuff, right? I mean, but no. the editors did not advocate socialism in the pages of the news. In fact, they totally declared war on anything like that. So if you were an anarchist and that was popular movement of the day, or a socialist or a communist, you didn't fare well in the pages of the Trail Creek News or Trail News. Here's a quote from one of the papers. "No system of socialism has ever proved a success, and history repeats itself," lectured one editor. "There is no royal road to fortune." And that's the mildest of the comments. They really went after them tooth and nail. One of the big news sources for the Trail Creek News, as you would imagine, is the workplace and the mining and smelting community and the mines that brought ore to the Trail smelter. And so a lot of the paper is filled with that kind of coverage. But one of the things that's kind of I noticed, of course, as Greg pointed out, I'm a labor historian originally, it was the coverage of the deaths and fatalities and accidents in the smelter. And they were horrendous. I mean, there were people getting their fingers cut off, and it was just an awful period for people, and they weren't doing anything about it. So what happens is the paper would report it, and then report the coroner's report, and then side with the company. So the smelter wasn't at fault. It was the workers' fault. And this consistently went on for the full 30 years. I looked at the paper, and they just wouldn't bend at all on that front. The other, and so it was a source of news, but a source of positive news for the likes of Heinz, but not so good for the working people. So little by little in the early 1900s, they started to form a union. A union had been formed by the miners in Rosalind since the mid-1890s. So they had some work. And Greg mentioned the Western Federation of Miners. They were actively organizing in Trail as well in that early period, and eventually got a union, but it took them till 1905. Meanwhile, a lot of guys died, sadly. Here are the editors on their anti-union nature. They're publishing in a town packed with miners and ragged-trousered workers. I mean, these guys come up from Butte, where Heinz ran his smelter. They're probably craving a union. But you wouldn't know it according to the paper, because basically they are down on unions, and they're particularly down on two radical unions. one of them is, well, first it was the Western Federation of Miners. The WFM was a radical union in those years that it stayed around but changed its name in 1916. The big one was the Wobblies. Everybody know what a Wobbly is? No, it's not an NDP putsch. The Wobblies were the industrial workers of the world, and they were popular in the, they started in 1905, I think Greg mentioned as well, and they were led by a guy named Big Bill Haywood, who shows up in Rosalind in the 1890s, late 1890s, and he gets a little bit of advice from some of the locals in town about his habit of drinking too heavily, and he's advised by a guy named Bill Casey at the local in Rosalind to settle down and stop so much on the sauce, right? But he makes a presence there, as do other Wobblies. A guy named Joe Hill shows up during the time I'm writing about. I'm not sure, but I think a woman named Mother Jones might have appeared there as well, or somewhere up in the area. So the place was crawling with socialists, and the paper was ready to go and criticizing them. Here's a little bit from it. The town has again been plastered. Oh, and the other union was the OBU. The one big union was popular around the time of the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, and they were socialists. That they wanted to run the place. So they were popular in some workplaces and not popular with the Trail Creek News. The town has again been plastered with the red labels of the OBU. About every so often, this red cloud casts its austere influence over Trail, and despite the fact that it has had its fling in this section and failed, it bobs up periodically to remind us that someone is trying to build up a job for himself at the expense of misguided workers. Labor has had enough of these red label men, and the sooner they realize this fact and go to work and earn an honest living, the better off they will be. The biggest labor story that took place was in 1917. That was the year that the smelter first went on strike. Been around since 1896, but they went on strike in 1917. This is a strike against the CPR, by the way, because they owned the smelter at this point. They bought the smelter in 1906. Anyway, the strike is led by a guy you may know. His name is Albert Ginger Goodwin. And he becomes quite a news source for the Trail Creek News. And Trail News, of course, he's a socialist, ran for the Socialist Party of Canada the year before, 1916, I think the election was. He lost, but he picked up 300 or 400 votes, so that's quite a lot for a guy who's calling himself a socialist in 1915. Anyway, you know the story probably, right? There's a couple of books written about him. Anyway, it's a long story and it continues to go on, but it's also a story that's covered in the Trail News. But it's not covered sympathetically. Goodwin was a draft dodger, or at least he wasn't at first. He was declared 4F. He wasn't supposed to be fit for military service. He had many illnesses. But because he was a socialist and because he led the strike in Trail in 1917, failed, by the way, the strike didn't win anything. It was trying to get shorter hours and a bit more money. They failed at that. But the tribunal that judges who gets to go to war and who doesn't found that after 6 months and after those events, he was somehow fit for military service. Well, he hightailed it. He headed out of town. And he ended up on Vancouver Island, around Comoss, that area, Courtenay. In fact, he's buried in Courtenay Cemetery. And there's a stone there with his Oh, Cumberland, sorry, yeah, that's right. Courtenay's next door, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, here's what the paper said about him. The town has again been, oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong way. Evidence was secured in the effects which the police gathered together, showing that Albert Goodwin is among them, and he is believed to be the leader of the gang. How many men are with Goodwin is not known, but the supplies captured indicate that the gang had prepared for a long stay. It is certain, too, that they were all armed. 5 Dominion and provincial police joined in the chase. So yeah, he was big news for the moment, and they give it quite a bit of coverage from week to week. This was in early August that he was declared shot dead by one of the special constables, and shot in the face. And the result was he became a national labor martyr, and we celebrate him every year. He not only that, but the first actual general strike was around his funeral. The first general strike in Canada, where everybody just downed tools and went on strike in favor of criticizing the handling of the Goodwin case. Yeah, I wanted to mention, I mentioned the fatalities and how they were covered, but not really, no analysis was done of how they died, why they died. There were a lot of, I'll read a little bit about some of their injuries. But before I do that, I want to add another news source for you. Pollution. We're in an age of being concerned about pollution, environmental safety, and so forth. There was no such concern then. The smelter was a great polluter of the region, and of course there were a lot of farmers in the region. And they were complaining that the pollution from in the Columbia River and also overhead was going into the little county next door to BC in Washington. And those farmers and other farmers before them complained about the pollution, and the paper supported the company, right? Bomb to the nostrils, bomb to the nostrils. Basically, they would never, ever give way. Anybody who actually claimed, brought suit against the company for pollution and for ruining their crops was not supported, ever. So that kind of was a little signal that we're dealing with a real business paper here. It's really not interested in helping out. Here's a little note, because another big source of the war, because I'm covering the First World War in this book, and it's interesting because it is a source of news. Of course, you have to cover the news, whether you're a weekly or a daily or the CBC radio if it were around then. But the paper had a hard time doing this, so it sort of cribbed from the other dailies in the area. The Rosalind Miner included, the Nelson paper, and it sort of tried to cover it kind of backhanded way, right, to tell people what the war was all about. And so it wasn't adequate. So what they did was they turned to some other source of news, letters home. And the Trail Creek News and Trail News are actually pretty good on this because they published full published letters of young soldiers overseas. Here's one. I've heard that A. Morgan has died of his wounds. I did not think he would live when we got him out of the trenches. I got 3 wounds in the left leg, 1 in the right hand, 1 in the right arm, and 2 in the chest. All my wounds are nearly well. I may lose my left thumb. It's no use anyhow, and it will be less to wash. All the boys, sense of humor all the way, right? All the boys have shown wonderful mettle, and every praise is due to them. Now, second letter was pretty jarring as well. It said, to be hit by shrapnel feels like being badly burnt all over. To be gassed is fearful. The war coverage in spring of 1918 mentioned that 100 trail men, I guess, not women, were drafted and on their way to Europe. And it's a reminder to people that you're sending bodies as well as whatever else you're shipping over there in the way of ore, because of course the smelter was producing lead and zinc, 2 pretty important metals for wartime. One for one part of the bullet and one for the other part. So they were an important source of war materials for the war, both wars actually, but we're talking First World War here. Here's some of the columns' names that were kind of interesting as they reported and included these excerpts from letters. One was called Echoes from the War, another was Trail Boys in Khaki, and their third was Slants on the Great War. So it gave people a little sense of the carnage that was going on, and it was also a chance to promote some hatred of the Hun and propaganda during the war, right? So that was kind of how they covered the war. Here's another little segment, because for 4 years they had to keep covering it, and as they got into the war, they were able to provide photographs, which hadn't been there until the war started. And other than a few little clips in advertising, but they had shots of dogfights over Europe or people in the trenches. Often they would produce pictures of Hitler or any of the Allied leaders. So that was kind of a real inventive part of the news. And other papers in the area, right? They were starting to actually show people the war and show them maps of the trenches and maps of the trenches of France. Now, Private Harold Weller, one of the original volunteers from Trail, returned last night minus an eye and with shrapnel wounds. Bilsam Mary had escaped from a German prison camp. Sergeant William Buterak announced that he had received the military medal for bravery. Herb Smith, former president of Local 105 of the Western Federation of Miners, wrote to thank the Smeltermen's War Fund. William A. Luff, another smelter worker, was killed in action in France. This is the kind of thing they got in the letters. That they didn't have reporters, right? They didn't have anybody they could send overseas to do any reportage. So in December of 1918, they could also read about one of the local guys, a guy named Private Mervyn Simmons. He was the subject of a book about being in a German prison camp. It was called Three Times and Out, Canadian Boys' Experiences in Germany. And you'll never guess who wrote it. Nellie McClung was the author of this book. So she was as you know, she was a political activist and a women's rights activist. And she was cranking a book out on this particular subject. So the news was getting around, and she must have read the Trail News. Of course, the paper wasn't all conflict and war, bickering with each other. The bickering was the fun part. You also got, and particularly during the war, you also got family and household tips. You might get there was a regular household tips column. It was written by someone in Washington but anyway, it would give you an idea of what to do when food was being rationed during war years, how you make a meal for a lot less than you usually pay, and where you get milk and butter. Interestingly, the paper also founded a news source to criticize women and girls. The editors were all men, and they would instruct women and girls on proper behavior and in the importance of marriage, of course. Here's a little quote. "There are women who maintain that their domestic career does not give full scope to their powers," argued one editor. "In the name of the great goddess common sense, what more do they want?" It was a fairly consistent commentary right through the 30 years, I must say. But, and this is with women working in the plant as well. And they sometimes jumped on the side of the anti-woman line as well, which surprised the dickens out of me. Another big source for a little paper like this is court news, police courts. And dog catcher news, it was all there, right? And often on the front page. But if somebody somebody of weak mind, quote unquote, was to do something like walk down the street, they were covered. And liquor offenses and liquor license offenses were also heavily covered. Anybody loitering around the streets, the wood sidewalks at night, may find themselves in court charged with intent. So it was just about anything any indecent act. Define it how you will. But they were news sources for the weekly news. They also and this is interesting for today's audience. They also gave some advice on how to handle pandemics, especially the one that occurred in 1918. I think that probably was the last big pandemic coming up to COVID-19, right? Anyway, at this time, people are frantically, in the medical profession, are frantically trying to develop vaccines to deal with that and other things. Polio was, a big issue then. So were measles, smallpox, scarlet fever. They were all diseases that were attacking people at the time. So medical people were trying to develop vaccines. The paper, however, was against the vaccines. The paper took umbrage. It felt that this was wrong, and here's one of the things it said. "It is repugnant to our idea of God and of nature to think that the only way we can render ourselves immune to disease is to resort to such a despicable practice as torturing one of the lower animals and injecting into our blood the filth from its diseased body." So the editor wasn't very happy, and I think he probably went in and out anti-vax. So another really delightful part of writing this book was examining the cultural side, the social side of Trail. And there was a big enough population that they could afford to have two movie houses, the Liberty and the Star. And there was a third that kind of pinch hit every once in a while. They saw movies. You could see a silent movie every couple days, right? They could also go to dances at Schwartz Hall, and local bands would play there, and some out-of-town bands, but far away as Spokane. And they also had the Trail Opera House. So, that was kind of an entertainment side. The Weekly was a big supporter. Now, part of the reason was there was a guy named Selwyn Blaylock who had come to town in 1899. He was a young assayer from McGill University in Quebec. And he had kind of set up shop with his first wife. And the papers sort of started noticing him, not because of what he would become, which is the president of the company in 1939, but because he was, let me just read it here, a rapidly rising defenseman in the hockey arena. In January of 1905, he scored the first goal of the home team against Rosalind, and in a spirited tussle with the puck. Blaylock would become a lifelong supporter of Kootenay hockey and other sports, by the way, and the Trail Smoke Eaters. And he was an important figure. He was on a number of different boards, and he was president and vice president of a number of sports boards as part of his community contribution. I wanted to just go to something that was fascinating for me as well. We talk about entertainment and the social side of trail life. One of the things the paper contributed to was poetry. It was very earnest in publishing local poets. Now, Kipling was there, Robert Service was there, you name it. The big poets, Wordsworth, the big poets were there, but every once in a while, a local poet showed up. And sometimes amateur poets are sometimes called poetasters. I don't know why. Anyway, one of them was a guy named Harry Hope. Harry was prominent in the 20s, and he had become quite well known, especially among the Scottish community, because he could emulate Robbie Burns and actually write the way Robbie Burns would talk as the bard of the Scottish working class. And that kind of made him a bit of a name. So the editor of the news was always on the lookout for a Harry Hope poem. Actually, really, he was the official or unofficial poet laureate of the town. This was the first time they'd ever had that. Although other poetry, which is a bit more doggerel-like, was showing up regularly in the news as well. I think one of the things that people liked about him was that he on some of his work, he turned to sports. And of course, in a town like Trail, sports is everything, right? I mean, everything shuts down for the game. Now, he is, in this particular poem that I'm going to read parts of for you, he recounts a hockey game between the Trail senior team and the Trail intermediate team. He tells the story of how the latter team won. It goes like this. I don't know who suggested it. It was a deep-laid scheme to have somebody wine and dine the senior hockey team. Hank had a craving, so I'm told, for hot hash spuds and chickens, and viewed the intermediates with thoughts of easy pickings. Now, poor Hank didn't quite end his way. And here's how Hogue ends the poem. The intermediates had the lead, and there they went to camp. Poor Harris in his scorer's seat, and almost writer's cramp. Try as they would, the seniors lost. The intermediates beat them. And now it's up to Hank et al. To buy the chicks and treat them. And that's a poem called That Chicken Dinner Episode. The editor must have been kind of a playful mood, because not too long after that, he inserted a shorter poem. Now, this is a period of time where the automobile was coming into vogue. People were starting to afford to buy cars. And the laws are kind of accommodating that, and gas stations are popping up. And the idea of motoring holiday is becoming quite popular. So there's lots of stuff on motoring on the sports pages. So it's considered kind of a sport. Here's the little poem, it goes like this. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Yet away from that parking place, I saw it first. They were playful, they were silly, it was fun, but it was also, as I say, quite horrible to different groups that they treated badly to. So I'm going to close now with a little story about family history. Um, my family came to Trail as immigrants from what was in those days known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anybody else from there? Anyway, there's one. They actually, my grandmother came from Slovenia, today is Slovenia, and my grandfather came from Croatia. So they end up in town. They don't really read or speak any English, so they don't really see the Trail News. But my interest in the paper was kind of partly inspired by them as immigrants coming and how would the paper treat them. So quite a bit of the book does try to come to terms with that. But they actually had 13 children. They started in Grand Forks and landed in Trail, up in the Gulch. And it's kind of, as I say, kind of inspired me to continue writing print novels. The kids probably picked up the odd paper, the older ones. So the oldest son was born in 1900, so he would have been, if he could read, he would have been old enough to read the news. And they, if they picked it up, they might read it to their mom and dad. They would probably find the results of the school exam on the front page, which might have been a little shaky, because they published the school tests. Nasty editors. A report on a church social, a canasta game, or a tea dance, or whist competition. So they were, and these were on the front page. Of course, the sports event would often end up on the sport page, and my uncles and some aunts would have been keen about reading about that. Well, there was one thing. I was around 1960. I was getting wonky-eyed with reading all these little newspapers. And I spotted something on the front page that kind of surprised me. Speaking of family history, it was a front page obituary. Not very much, a little bit, but it was on the front page. Had a headline, and it was about some guy named Frank Verzuh. And it was my grandpa. I couldn't read it, but he was in the paper anyway. I think he was a part-time owner of something called the Victoria Hotel in Trail, which burnt down for some reason. I'm still not sure how he got it, because I don't think he had a lot of money. Maybe he won it in a poker game. That could have happened in Trail in those days. So let me just say the community, the family, local business for sure, but the paper was incredibly supportive of these kinds of values. And they may not satisfy us today, but in those days, this was the set of values that they were promoting. I'll just end with this last quote or two. The news editor in the later time of the book is a little bit of a philosopher. He says, "I am the country newspaper. I am the friend of the family, the bringer of tidings from other friends. I speak to the home in the evening light of summer's vine-clad porch or the glow of winter's lamp. I speak the language of the common man. My words are fitted to his understanding." They get quite floral. And he ends with this: "My congregation is larger than that of any church in my town." Move over John Lennon. "And my readers are more than those in the school. Young and old alike find in me stimulations, instruction, entertainment, inspiration, solace, comfort. I am the chronicler of birth and love and death, the great facts of man's existence. I am the country newspaper." And that's how they felt about themselves. They were building a community. They were building a town.
Have you got the author there?
The author of that particular quote? Yeah, I can dig it out for you. I don't have it handy, but
because I think it appears in many papers.
Yeah, it's been around. Yeah, it's been around. Anyway, that's my story.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I should add a thank you to you for listening and for your applause, and to the Federation. It's great to be a board member there, and it's so great to be in person. We've been looking at little boxes for years.
Are you able to take a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You started with the anecdote about someone wanting a retraction. Do you mention people putting pressure to keep their name out of the paper?
Some of it.
Yeah, because I recall when I was an editor way back in the day, man coming to me and kind of shamefacedly said, you know, I've been convicted with impaired driving, you know, can you keep my name out? Of course I said no. Anyway, I think that happens a fair bit.
There was quite a bit, and he writes about it in a poem where he's saying, if you don't want your name in the paper, but quit sleeping with your wife's, you know. Yeah, so he gets into that a little bit. Like I said, they were feisty guys. They would be pretty sassy, John.
The telegraph. When does the telegraph come into Trail?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Because I'm
Thanks,
thinking
John.
about until the telegraph comes in, you only got local news.
Exactly. So as I said, I did mention that the telegraph, the CPR would not bring the telegraph in during Ron Font's time. So he could not cover wars, he could not cover international news other than just cribbing it from other newspapers. And I'm not sure what they actually came in. This is around the time they were getting the telephone in town as well. And every week the report would be there, 12 telephones in Trail, and your number is 1, 2, 3. But it did eventually come in, right, once the CPR started to get rolling with the smelter.
Yeah, and the other point is the cars. Without the cars, who do you play? I mean, what other communities have got a team that you can play against?
For hockey, you mean, or?
Well, for any kind of sport.
Well, there were a lot of other teams.
We had to get to each other.
There was a sand hockey team, you know.
Yeah, but how do you get there without a car?
Well, there were trains and ferries, and yeah. But in the motoring thing, this is something I didn't know very much about. Greg, you probably know more than I do, but at some point we were driving on the other side of the road.
Yeah.
So yeah, that I didn't know. I don't know exactly when the conversion took place, and I don't know.
1922.
1842?
1922.
1922, yeah, so I don't know how many accidents were registered in 1923. But I guess there's only one way to change sides, right? That's to go all at once. So that was kind of
Maybe
interesting.
start with heavy trucks.
Yeah. By the way, it's another interesting book that's just come out. I review books for BC Review, and it just got posted. It's a book that Greg actually did the introduction to. It's called Room at the Inn. And it talks about these motoring holidays and how people would look for the old historic hotels and stay in them, or go for the week for family holidays. And he writes about 40 of them in the interior of BC, and it's a delightful read. And all of this, skullduggery that gets on in the beer park. Which, of course, as you know, in 1917 there was prohibition. So for 5 years there was no liquor allowed. And a big debate too, by the way, in the paper around who should control the liquor flow. Should it be the government, or should we let private enterprise take care of it? And of course, as you know, the government won that one. At least it did for a while. Anybody else?
I'm wondering with what's happened in the industry, the loss of so many papers and consolidation, what do you think about who's taking that place now in communicating within a community like Trail or any community, and what's changed?
Well, the internet is, I think, mainly what changed. There was I quoted actually in the afterwards the book that 60 Minutes ran a piece last year on the death of the weekly newspaper, the death of the community newspaper, and partly it's attributed to just basically the economies of scale. When you've got a social network that's beating you out every day, it takes away a real element of the community, and people comment and criticize it, and it's true. But I'm not sure we have a chance to fight that, especially with something like AI and artificial general intelligence coming along. I'm not even sure we'll have people running newspapers anymore. But yeah, that's the main source that I could find. Did you have another thought on it? Did you think there was something else that was behind it?
Oh, I agree with what you're saying. I mean,
Advertising.
The economics of it are working, but our community's finding other ways to communicate.
I think some of them are boldly keeping their newspapers alive.
Facebook pages. Princeton has a Facebook page.
Yeah, but I know in one case, the one the 60 Minutes covered, they actually combined with a couple of other communities, and they kept producing it, but it had 3 names on it. But it was essentially a community newspaper, but they couldn't afford to keep going by themselves. Yeah, interesting times we're moving into, again, different times from 120 years ago. Okay, anybody else? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.